friends, this is Rick, the Grease Man. This is my second attempt at this because apparently my sound is not wanting to work, and I'm only hoping that the sound stays on and works now because I don't have my headphones on. I'm going through the laptop video. Bob Lazar's story over and over and over again talks about 9 spacecraft that he saw at S4. The sports model, the one he currently worked on, the one he himself worked on or had some first-hand physical contact with, and that the power device system, the power core anti-gravity device that he was hired to fiddle with came out of this machine. And he did say at one point he saw 9 craft. There was one against the wall, and there were 8, including the one that he labeled sports model. And he had a nickname for most of them, but I have yet heard all 9 of them. So I've heard he's talked about the jello mold and the top hat and the disc, and of course the sports model. So the other 5 he did not have a nickname for, at least in none of the video interviews that I have seen of Bob Lazar. So if anybody has heard of him speaking and describing the other craft, I mean, point me in the direction of that video or interview because I would dearly love to see it. It kind of annoys me when I listen to his detractors, to debunkers and skeptics that they don't bother. Look, I'm not perfect. I'm not going to have and say that I have all the information, that I've done all extensive research into the Bob Lazar story because we just don't have that kind of time. But I do and have made plenty of efforts to try to be consistent. And the consistent part of Bob Lazar stories are consistent. Quite a bit of it is consistent. Over the years, over the decades, the same story, including 9 craft. He doesn't vary or waver from that. But his detractors and the skeptics often offhand they don't bother with it because they're so convinced that everything he says is BS. So, there might be 8 craft, or there was 15 craft, or there was, and I've heard them. I've watched some of those too. Because the best way to understand things is to see what other people's viewpoints and opinions and perspectives are. The whole point of the reason I'm doing what I'm doing now is because it's an interesting topic, and it's enough so that I want to spend some of my valuable time getting my 2 cents worth out there on it, and discussing these things with a handful of people viewers that have commented, and we've had a few minor discussions with. It's great stuff, right? So the fact is he's seen 9 craft, and he's adamant that he only had physical encounters with the specific 1 craft related to his would-be research. And so when we look at this, I start looking at it and thinking about the 9 craft. One day the government didn't just wake up one day and find 9 alien spacecraft or alien or whatever they are, right? And suddenly throw them together in a warehouse. No, these is a collection that came over time. And there are some comments that Bob Lazar has made over the years that lend itself to some additional speculation and curiosity. He is led to believe that the particular vehicle he was working on came from an archaeological find. But he doesn't go into any more detail on that. It's either because he doesn't have the details, or the details are so crazy that he just isn't worth he just doesn't want to continually try to argue the point, or he simply doesn't really have all the information, which would be more than realistic. I mean, the government is extremely paranoid and compartmentalistic as to so much that it's very possible that different branches of the U.S. military government could be running their own versions of S4, although the fact they're not telling the others that they're doing it. Not because they're not aware that there's another program going, but because of their own political or whatever drive to be the first or to have their own little playground to play with. So I look at the craft and I got thinking, okay, potentially one of these craft came from Roswell. The story goes that a crashed UFO crashed at Roswell. It's actually implied in more than one spot that there was several. There was 2, because there was a debris field, a large debris field, then a small debris field where the damaged craft was located, and so the potential that perhaps these craft that collided, because these are not anything by any means original. I've got this information from other sources the years. Potentially, these two spacecraft collided and one disintegrated. Another possibility that's very rarely talked about is the potential that one craft shot down the other craft and obliterated it. Because if we go back to Bob Lazar's story, and where he talks about the fellow who used to work with Barry, who died in an accident when that was reported as an unscheduled nuclear explosion in the desert, but was implied that they were trying to physically cut through one of these anti-grav power source devices and to figure out how the insides worked and what they looked like, and in their ultimate wisdom set off a thermonuclear explosion of some sort, or something that remotely looked like an antimatter explosion. Would still be, even a tiny one would be insidiously damaging and could be easily passed off as something nuclear. Because who's actually going to be there and say, hey, it didn't go off that way? But the fact was that this individual, or maybe a team of individuals, were either on site physically doing it, which I find that highly doubtful. They were probably in a bunker quite a ways away and were remotely using a cutting tool, plasma torch, what have you, to try to cut a slice of one of these things, or cut one of these things in half so they could get it inside it. Because Bob Lazar acknowledged a little bit that even Barry, they're just guessing with the device. They had very little progress for the time that the government has had in their possession, in part because there's only so much you can do when it comes to reverse engineering, without actually dismantling things. And dismantling the components of the device are pretty simplistic. Something about the size of a basketball, some kind of cone, some kind of place where you put an element of 115 in, and pretty much in a base for it to sit on. And they guess what the base is. They have no idea what the cone is, because he never was provided with that information, and he hadn't been there long enough to figure it out, more than he did the sphere. He just knows that when you assemble all the pieces together, and it's in the proximity of the equipment on board one of these crafts, they power up and they operate. So extreme advanced technology would be magical to us, and in a lot of aspects, in my personal opinion, could be deemed very simplistic looking. It seems like something that could be very easily had been manufactured, a very complicated piece of equipment, or a series of pieces of equipment that were manufactured in a very advanced version of a 3D printer, for example. Something that's so self-contained that there's no moving parts. The fact it would lend itself to being very reliable and very resilient, which brings me to another point that Bob Lazar makes about the craft. He suggests or implies that this device universally would power any one of those 9 craft. So that begs the question: are all 9 craft, even though many of them are distinctly different looking, come from the same race of beings supposedly that created all this stuff? Are they from different competing alien entities out there? The fact that the device powers them all universally implies that they were all constructed by the same people and using the same core power source. Now, evolution, well, we don't know how old these things are, or potentially are, and the government is one of those many things I'm sure the government would like to know, just how new and old the devices are. So the one that Bob Lazar works on, it was suggested to him or told to him that it came from an archaeological dig, that's a sports model specifically. And the stockpile element 115, he's not 100% sure. He's not even 5% sure on where and how our government got such a large stockpile, because it sounds like that's enough of this chemical or this element agent to destroy a good chunk of the continental United States if it ever was somehow ignited in one go, just based off of what little element damage came from slicing into one of the engine cores of a small fighter-shaped craft. So the fact that they possibly came from an archaeological dig, of course he doesn't go any kind of details on that. He doesn't know, or they never told him, or it wasn't pertinent to what he needed to know. So he only got what he heard half-assed or partway, or put things together in a short time he had access to this stuff. So the fact that the potential that one of these craft could have been sitting around in a cavern or a cave or the bottom of a temple somewhere for thousands of years is not unrealistic. And that the same power source that runs this thing would be running any of these others that could be a much newer element device. So the one that shot down or got crashed in Roswell, assuming it's related to these, the same power source, much newer craft potentially, possibly. We don't know. I don't know how. One of the things I've always speculated. This is a part of it. We're blind to some aspects of a lot of potential things because of how our own society and our own world operates. And one example is we have what's called engineered obsolescence. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce the word. The idea was, I read a book years and years ago called Wheels. It was on from the 70s on the automotive industry, and it was intentionally designed. Vehicles are intentionally designed to fall apart. They have a shelf life. Your Maytag washer and dryer was so famous because they're so durable. They run for decades without needing repairs. Well, the truth is we have a disposable society, and we have a consumer-hungry, consumer-driven society in the largest portions of the world. And thus, the idea of having something that will last indefinitely is not exactly a good thing towards, wanting to buy the next good thing. I mean, how often, my dad was a big believer that you don't need to have a brand new car. You can have a perfectly good used car that you will spend a far lot less money on. If you take all your maintenance and all your repairs on a 10-year-old car or a 20-year-old car, and that you've owned for 10 years, or 20 years in his case, and put it together, it would still be less than what it costs to buy that brand new car in the modern era age. And I believe there's a lot to be said about that. So the same reason was speculated back in the 70s why Japanese cars of the time, like the Datsuns and Subarus, were far more reliable than their American counterparts, is because where the American counterparts, we would use a plastic screw that costs 2 cents, but will wear out in 3 or 4 years, or just snap and break it at a random point. And the Japanese used a metal screw that would last for 50 years. So the fact is their cars were better built, and from that perspective, and it does that hold true today too. And a lot of our stuff is designed, look at our laptops and computers. This device I got now, I spent $600 for just recently. The last one lasted about 2.5 years and starting to have issues. You could go into a shop. There was a time when you could take your TV to a repair shop and get it fixed. It's not cost effective to do that. I took a VCR one time back in the early 90s to a shop, and there were still some electronic shops around that did repairs, and the guy told me what needed done, and then he was just brutally honest. He said the amount of cost for the parts and labor is going to cost you as much or almost, if not more, than what it would cost just to go buy a new one. And it's even more so now. You can get DVD players for $30, $40, and if they go bad, you throw them in the trash and you get another one. So if you were an advanced society, extremely advanced society, ideally you would have gotten far past that kind of mindset. So things you are going to create are going to be very durable. The potential for them being having a great longevity. So the same goes with the manufacturing process. Now, he describes the craft in some pretty unique terms. He seems like it was the majority of the craft was pressure molded. It was in a mold. And I speculate, well, that's true. Or if you go by 3D engineering that we know today, the potential of what is 3D engineering going to be like in 500 years or 50 years. The odds are that we can manufacture an entire car body from raw materials to one solid piece is not unrealistic. It's actually probably going to be fact, and not too many more decades down the road. It's the same idea. It's the same reason I talk about the technology of the anti-grav engine the way I do. I imply, and it sounds like it's very simplistic in its complexity. It's so complex it looks simple. It looks like a couple of child's toys that just get put together. Right? A spherical thing goes on a cone, or a tubular thing that sits on a square base. And they think that there's a cyclotron in the base, but without cutting the base open and actually seeing its interior, they don't know. And the fact that there seems to be no seams, no bolts, no fasteners, no connections, there's no extra wiring or tubing or plumbing or any of this sort of stuff to these devices suggests very complicated, simplistic construction. So these things were formed as a single piece. They were constructed, and put together. Whether they use some sort of, I don't know, replicator technology, or which would be an advanced, super advanced version of 3D printing. right? Or 3D printing, or mold injections, which would be very, very crude and archaic to a very advanced human society. Although, you know, the wheel has the materials that the wheels are made out of have changed. Their appearance have changed, but their function have not. The wheel today on our modern car is about the same thing as the earliest wooden wheels stuck on through it with an axle, hauled by oxen. The only difference is the principle is very consistent. It's just that the technology has advanced considerably. But we have reached a certain point in time at certain elements of our own modern society, our own modern materials that don't change. A hammer is a hammer is a hammer. How often have you, taken, probably don't think about that stuff very often, if ever. Why would you? I have a tendency to think I have an overactive imagination. That's one of my biggest flaws. But I have my great grandfather's hammer in the garage, and my father used it for many years, and his father used it before him, and it came from my great grandfather. And it was made in about the turn of the century, early 1900s, 1900 something. And aside from having replaced the handle once, my dad had to replace the handle once when it split, got dry rotted. The head's the same. It's the same tool that's been used now for the better part of 120 years, and for generations. And there's no reason for me to go out and buy a brand new hammer. Yes, the new hammers have a little better peeling, maybe a little smoother metal surface, and maybe a little difference in the claw design. Their handles today are mostly plastic, but why go out and have 5 hammers on my wall? I don't have to have 5 hammers. I don't need them. So I have a durable piece of equipment that's lasted 4 generations, and willing will go one of my kids or the grandkids and continue on. Save somebody $30, $20 to buy a hammer, right? Just unless somehow it gets mortally damaged, it's going to last a long, long time. And our society is not geared at our consumption, disposable society is not on that page. And I would like to think that if in the future, down the road, we will become much more aware of that sort of the advantages of the durable society, the material that doesn't need to be replaced that often. So the fact that maybe an alien species that is projected to be 1 million years potentially more advanced than us, et cetera, will have discovered that we can make a device and leave it in the field and come back 1,000 years later and still find it completely functional, completely usable. So the idea that potentially this Morse model was found in a cavern somewhere or buried under the ground and come out looking like it was factory fresh isn't outrageous, right? So we look at that. So it's also the story itself that's appealing, because in my mind, if you're going to make up a bunch of BS, well, the government captured it. They got it crashed in the desert. It's far easier than to say, oh, well, they found it in an archaeological dig. Well, that just opens a whole lot of other complexity questions, and Bob Lazar directly refuses to talk about those. So the potential for the craft, where it was found, how it was found, who found it. You got to think, when was it found? We talk about archaeological digs. It could have been 100 years ago. It could have been 200 years ago. It's been sitting in a government barn somewhere until they built S4. I mean, the government has been fiddling with this thing since before, our great-grandparents were alive. Who knows? So the other craft in at S4 didn't all come from the same location. The fact that the descriptions vary considerably makes me go, well, some people, Bob Lazar implies that power source that he was hired to fiddle with would function in any one of those craft. So potentially the technology for the power source is like the epitaph of the technology for the people that created this thing. This is the extreme uber edge of technology, because once you've designed something that can do this, how much difficult would it be to find something that does it better? So when we look at our society, once again, the internal combustion engine has been around since the beginning of automobiles and before. The fact that it has evolved and become more complicated and complex, more efficient, more environmentally friendly, etc., is beside the point. The functions of the internal combustion engine is pretty much the same as they were 100 years ago. The Model A and Model T, the basic functions, the basic concepts are the same as the ones sitting in my SUV outside, or in my van. So the truth is that technology would advance to a certain point, and it's only been in recent decades that we started pushing for an electric engine because it's more cost effective and efficient and even more environmentally friendly, except it has a whole lot of problems. The batteries are huge and expensive, the limited amount of charge it can carry, etc., still makes the internal combustion engine the preference. Now, that said, we have built hundreds of models of vehicles. They're all powered by the same type of engine. They use the same kind of fuel source. They use the same kinds of fuel tanks, etc., They might be a little more improved, but the craft themselves, Frankie, you're getting on my nerves. Get off the table. She keeps jumping up here because she wants to sit on the laptop. You don't need up here. Hello, the cat. So there's no reason, in my mind, the technology that powers the spacecraft, that allow these spacecraft to move and function, could probably be the same technology that these beings may have been using for thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, because they have yet to find another replacement that will work for it. So, and there's no, or they've decided there's no reason to try to find something more than what we have, because what's the point? Now the craft themselves keep changing and modifying, because Bob Lazar's descriptions give us multiple different. No two are identical in his, from what I take away. He doesn't outright say that at any point that I know of, but all the descriptions suggest that they're not identical. So they may serve different purposes, just like our aircraft, and vehicles today serve different purposes. Same internal, a variant of the same engine that runs my work truck runs a tractor at a farm 10 miles away from here. So the tractor and the truck look nothing alike. But the fact that the diesel engines that run them are pretty much the same model is not outrageous. So the same with our aircraft. We have everything from gliders to Piper Clubs to extreme fifth generation fighter craft and bombers and passenger liners of all shapes and sizes. But the engines that power them are consistently based on the same principles. So the possibility that you could take the jet engines out of one craft and shoehorn them into another craft and get that craft to fly is not outrageous in our own our own less than perfect engineering capabilities. So somebody that's much more advanced technology, much more superior than what we have, would be much more simpler for them to do so. So the fact that maybe all these things are mold injected, when you look at time and development of technology, Bob Lazar continually suggests, like the hull of the space model sports model was potentially mold injected creations, all one thing, all one piece. The material, whether it's metal or ceramics or some other composite that hasn't been defined yet, that was all one piece. I can amplify that perhaps if they're using some advanced version of 3D printing, could have printed this whole damn thing from raw materials. And if we go Star Trek technology, futuristic materials, potential for a replicator technology is more than plausible. If you drop 1,000 years from now on Earth, and if we haven't eliminated ourselves, or Mother Nature hasn't managed to eliminate us, then potential for coming up with more technology that we see in our version of sci-fi is plausible, in part because we dream it to be possible. I listened to some people with modern cell phones, the flip tops that came out in the 80s and the 90s. Those were driven by people who loved the concept of the Star Trek's communicator, the idea. And now it's so commonplace we don't think twice. The fact that one of our cell phones is far more complicated than the computers of the Apollo craft, the Apollo mission spacecraft. It's just short generation leaps, right? And the technology breeds technology, and there's a connection or a potential connection there with all this Bob Lazar stuff. I'm saving that for a future video as well. So when we look at the other source material for where these other craft potentially came from, I think of Roswell right off the bat and Kecksburg. But those are two different things. Roswell, over and over and over and over again, the stories are they found a crashed saucer in the desert, and there's two debris fields. And potentially these things either ran into each other, or they're from opposing entities, and they have a grudge, and one shot the other one out of the sky and obliterated it. And if we go by Bob Lazar's understanding of his predecessor's death, that's quite plausible. If we took a plasma cutter to one of these things' engines and it set off a nuclear explosion or something similar to a nuclear explosion and obliterated a team of scientists doing the cutting, what do you think one of these things shooting a ray gun at another one's going to do? It's probably going to shoot it and destroy it into very small pieces and scatter it across a couple of miles of landscape. And it's said, Bob Lazar has said, that there was a project connected to this particular craft he was working on because it did have some sort of energy-based weapon, and that they had removed it or they were working on it. They were trying to do the same concepts, trying to reverse engineer it. And once again, there's more information that I have opinions on. That's good for another video. Anyway, so potential for another one is being recovered from something that got knocked out of the sky. Whether it had a mechanical failure on its own part, something knocked it down, somehow we knocked it down. And that's also something, because I've read some stuff and seen some stuff quite recently about the Russians when they actually used to go after these things and tried to shoot them down. Purposely tried to shoot these things down. And after a while, these things decided they had had enough of it and made an example out of a number of Soviet advanced fighters and pilots, to the point where the Soviet command said, do not engage these things. Whatever they are, they're not a threat to us, or they're not something we can deal with, and we're going to pretend like we're going to watch and observe and otherwise ignore them. Do not, under any circumstances, shoot at one. See, even the Russians can learn a lesson after a while. So how many other nations and countries have encountered these things, right? So there's a potential source. We picked up this. The fact that the archaeological thing is still plausible, because when they talk about UFOs, a lot of people act and talk as if this is some modern phenomenon, that this started in the 50s after the World War, and after the nukes became prevalent, suddenly we've seen all kinds of flying things that we couldn't identify. The truth is, and you know and I know it, because otherwise you wouldn't listen to this video or any of these things, if you go back in history and you look at history, there's evidence from as far back as the caveman days that imply things were flying through the air that nobody could identify. Things were flying through the air in a time when no such man-made craft existed. Back in Roman times and Grecian times, and this is the stuff I'm familiar with. It's just ancient alien stuff, right? And then in more modern times, the 1800s, there's stories of big cigar-shaped things floating through the sky, and this was before balloons and dirigibles were commonplace or even existed. And there's a small town in the Southwest, I can't think of it off the top of my head, but there's a local mythology that one of these things crashed in a field, and a short-lived survivor who was very small, almost childlike in the dimensions, was the townspeople came upon him and were trying to do their best to save him and help him, and were also equally freaked out by him. Anyway, he passed away and he died, and they buried him in a local cemetery. And they took the materials from the craft and they threw them down a well or something like this. And a lot of people got sick and died in the years after that, suggesting that there was some kind of radiation leak or something. And then at some point in some decades later, some people from the government, or claimed to be from the government, showed up. They moved the body, or the townspeople moved the body, because too many people were coming out there and gawking it and causing problems at the gravesite, and that the burial site for the craft was removed as well. So, once again, the history is just check full. You can look at videos, or you can look at ancient paintings, you can read texts, Bible, various cultures. Look at the mythology from the Anunnaki from Sumeria. Then there's the Indians, India's ancient mythology, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the possibilities. And of course, then there's the last possibility. One is either the most credulous, the most, I don't want to say complicated, but in a second here, I'm going to check the cat again. Okay. I love Frankie. She's a good cat. I put her outside the door, and I close the door. She'll sit outside the door and cry and cry and cry because she wants in here. And if he gets in here, then she either wants to play and jump around and get into things, or just be Frankie. You gotta love her. So, like I said, the possibility that some of these advanced beings just simply gave us the stuff or left the stuff where we could find it. Now, I had to question that because, like Bob Lazar's analogy, if we put a nuclear reactor and take it back to the 1800s and give it to the people in general, and they're going to want to know how this thing works, they're going to tear it apart and then they're all going to die, or they're going to set it off and blow up a big chunk of London or something like that, and steampunk age is not going to function. But the potential for the damage is there. The idea that some advanced species would just purposely leave the technology this fantastic laying around, and then just it's one thing. Yeah, we put it in a supply catch, or it was no longer needed, or we just abandoned it. As we do that all the time. Just look at go to Antarctica and look at how much stuff we've hauled down there, and it gets buried up in the ice, and it'll be there 1,000 years, 10,000 years from now. Somebody else will dig it up and go, "Ooh, well, look at this stuff." What is this? Oh, it's some sort of internal combustion engine. Well, that's very inefficient, and self-destructive. Well, yeah, but they had it for 500 years. So the technology didn't change much in 500 years. It wasn't until they come up with whatever. The fact of the other, the idea that they otherwise would just land in the backwater somewhere and where, Nellis Air Force Base and say, step out of it and say, here you go, toss you the keys and then get in another UFO and fly off. Yeah, I find that very, incredible or very questionable, but not 100% positive. I truly believe that anything is plausible, even the most implausible has a possibility of some element of it could be. It's just hard to know and figure out. Now go back and talk on. We'll touch on the Kecksburg for a second. The Kecksburg Bell is a couple things come to mind right off the bat. A lot of people witnessed the thing come down, right? The fact that the military was almost there immediately after it came down suggests that the military was expecting it to come down or were tracking it somehow and were en route. Fact was they had to have been alerted to before. I think they had to know that it was either deorbiting and had time to get there because, there's no military bases right next door to Kecksburg. So the fact that a very large contingent of the military showed up to salvage this thing or acquire this thing meant that they were already in motion before this thing came down. Second, there's a lot of suggestion or implication that the Kecksburg Bell was either a Russian satellite or somebody's satellite that came down, and this technology we would want to get a hands on just so we could see what they're doing, how they're doing things different from what we're doing, and whether or not they're ahead of us or behind us or beside us, etc., etc. And we wouldn't go out of our way to tell everybody it was a Russian satellite. Although, you know what? That sort of story will be far more viable for the lion's share of people than anything else. And denying that anything came down at all just fuels the imagination. That's the most stupidest thing to say, and the most idiotic thing to tell people. It was nothing. It's swamp gas. Bullshit. It's a Russian satellite. I'll buy that every day. It's a Chinese satellite. Much easier to buy. But there's this connection with this thing called the Nazi bell. This one of these uber weapons or devices that the Nazis were trying to construct, and there's a lot of conjecture about exactly what the bell was, whether it was even real. Although in recent decades or so, they have found the site that they believe that it operated from, including a very complex ring structure that potentially the bell was chained to keep it from just zipping off. And if it had truly devised some sort of anti-gravity technology, it may have been just like a hot air balloon. It would needed to be controlled, and perhaps the ability to control itself was very erratic. The site itself has some massive power conduits that are buried under the ground in these tunnels that lead up to this ring, this stone ring, and it's suggested the implications there that more and more that this Bell potential was there, that they were working on something, whether or not it functioned, it's hard to say because the device disappeared. So as the war ended, the Bell disappeared. Its research, majority of its research materials disappeared, and so did one of the key people involved in the project. Now, my middle of the road, middle education, middle America, poor American mindset makes me think, the end of the world's happening. The Nazi Party's going to crash. They're bailing out like rats, filling a sinking ship, and some of them are going to face some terrible repercussions for what they did and didn't do during the war. And best to be elsewhere. And if this thing had any kind of capability of extra dimensional travel or extra spatial travel, this thing actually could go into space and come back. Sure, take off. If you could even fly this thing, this Bell could fly around the planet and go to, I don't know, any place other than Nazi Germany, you're probably going to do that. And I think that may have been what happened if this thing existed. Otherwise, one government or another got their hands on it and they buried it under a bunch of innuendo and half-truth and lies and silence. So the potential that the United States government or the British got their hands on it or the Russians got their hands on it is plausible. So it's odd or interesting, or implications are potentially that if this thing was some kind of trans-dimensional device or some machine that was designed to cross the dimension or time, and having it show up over Kecksburg and crashing, well, that's kind of stretching things a whole lot. But it's not in the realm of impossible. Because the impossible is just improbable, and probable is by degree. So the more improbable something is, the lesser chances of it actually being something. Doesn't mean that there isn't some kind of chance, even as minuscule as you can calculate for something happening. So there could be some truth to it. But is it one of those 9 craft that Bob Lazar saw at S4? My belief is that it would not be. If this was a man-made device, no matter how sophisticated or extreme it was, that the U.S. government would have another facility or other facilities who are working on terrestrial technology. It might have been a one-time thing. Somebody stumbled onto a way to create a device that could travel through dimensions or time or space or between dimensions or faster than what have you or slower than what have you. Maybe it froze time as it knew it and it sat there invisible as the world moved around it. So the possibilities are quite endless, but it's still terrestrial. It's still man-made. So the possibility that it was sitting in S4 just doesn't sit well with me. And that there's never been an indication that Bob Lazar saw anything of that nature. Just like the Tic Tac device, he didn't see something like that there because he didn't describe it. Right? I mean, if he did, I haven't yet. Like I said, if you've heard a video or read something where he actually describes all 9 craft, I'd like to know. I'd like to see it. In this case, though, I think the government would have multiple special sites, various areas of, not just S4, but other places and other locations around the world to do research into technology of all sorts. And potentially that if we have the Nazi Bell and the Kecksburg Bell is the same damn thing, or maybe something that's the next generation from the Nazi version, that would be someplace else, in my opinion, for what it's worth. So anyway, I babbled on enough about that. Hopefully the sound is placed on this, because if I have to do a third one, it's going to be sometime later in the week, because I have to work this afternoon. Till next time, my friends, just keep an open mind, all right? Stay safe. The world's in a very dangerous spot. America is a very dangerous crossroad today. And I'm sad to see that I have to see it. I'm glad my parents didn't live to see this. And I'm scared that we don't do something seriously, make some serious changes very fast. The democracy experiment that this country is supposed to be is going to turn into something it's never meant to be. And that will not be good for us, for you, for my cat, or for the world. for humanity in general. Until next time.